hosted by the Ecological Design Center and the School of Architecture and Allied Arts here at the University of Oregon. With us this afternoon, I'd like to say this for the first time, direct from Hong Kong is Juan. Juan is the founding director of IDU Architecture, a research and design office with projects ranging from the extent of built forms through social and ecological processes of the city. She has been invited to speak, has been published, and has exhibited internationally. She was the chief curator of Hong Kong's exhibition at the 2010 Venice Biennale of Architecture, the housing of an affordable city exhibition at the 2011 Shenzhen Hong Kong Bi-City Biennale, and was assistant curator for the first Shenzhen Biennale of Urbanism and Architecture in 2005. Juan is also an associate professor and director of the Masters of Architecture program at the University of Hong Kong. She was previously taught at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Graduate Center at Peking University. She holds a master's degree in architecture from Princeton University and is a recipient of the U.S. Fulbright Foundation Scholarship for Research on the Transformation of the Contemporary Chinese City. Her talk today is entitled Urban Ecologies. Please help us welcome Juan.
Thank you, Dan. Is this audible? Yeah. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for the invitation to come and speak. I did come directly from Hong Kong, stop over in San Francisco, but I also went to a big state school in the U.S. For undergraduate studies. It was a big football team and a beautiful picturesque campus just like yours. So it was quite nostalgic for me to walk around last night and today. So it's really nice to be here, and it's reminded me how beautiful spring can be when you're in an environment that has very distinct seasons. This is very different from Hong Kong, where the weather is about 10 months of the year, it's just hot, humid summer. And then the other 2 months is kind of really cold, kind of non-weather for a while. So it's really nice to be here. I bring with me sort of a 3-part talk, and we'll see how time goes if I'll make it all 3 parts. The first part is research, kind of a research project that's been ongoing for the past nearly a decade, on a phenomenon of informal urbanization in Shenzhen, the city adjacent to Hong Kong. And the second part is a urban design project that is located in Shenzhen that very much is based on the research, the ongoing research of urbanization in a developing city, and more importantly, a rapidly developing environment. And then finally, the last is, I think, a really fun project I'd like to share with you, something that I did with my students this recent past semester. So we'll see if we make it there. But all of them have a broad, I think, philosophy that is something that I've been trying to, in the office, to cultivate through design research projects and also through teachings, those notion urban ecologies. And essentially, I'm an architect. I'm not a landscape architect, and I'm not an ecologist. But I believe that we all should really understand the built environment as something that must be rooted in the environmental systems, biological systems, the social and community resources, the economic operations of the city, and the cultural values of the context. And it's only through engaging actively with these various parameters that the built via our design interventions comes to life and can really truly have a responsible and sustainable meaning. So that's the broad context or philosophical approach of the works. So the first part, like I said, it's a research project in Shenzhen. It's titled 1,000 Years of an Instant City. As we're literally thousands of miles away, I just would like to know a little bit the context I'm speaking, how many of you have been to Shenzhen? Okay, so a few. Okay, that's good. How many have been to Hong Kong? More people than that. Okay, good. Thank you. So we're talking about 10-20% of the audience. So Shenzhen is located in the Pearl River Delta. I'm sure all of you, even though if you have not been to Shenzhen, if you're familiar with global economy, or at least Ram Koolhaas's research through Harvard, you probably have, if not read, have seen the big fat book called Great Leap Forward, which is really about the urbanization in Pearl River Delta. Just to give you a little bit of background, the Pearl River Delta is, do we have a pointer? Is located in southern China, bordering Hong Kong and Macau. Its current population, the conservative estimate is about 45 million, with a GDP of $300 billion US. So it's absolutely a key player in the global economy. And what's remarkable is that it's quite recent. It's only been 30 years, really, since it started to take on that stage. This is a NASA image of kind of the mouth of the Pearl River Delta in 1979. It's a significant year for my part of the research, which I will get to. So this is infrared image. So what you see that's red will be vegetation, and the little specks of white. Not sure what the point is, but along to the right-hand side, along the river is urbanized land. This is 2003. So 20 years, essentially. The rate of urbanization and sort of the material construction in the region is phenomenal. In fact, according to NASA's research, it's sort of unprecedented in human history that such a massive scale of urbanization has permanently altered the weather pattern of the region and therefore influencing globally. So just to give a bit of context, a lot of the urbanization of the area was really led by Chinese government's policy of open up and reform in the late 70s and early 90s, especially with the setup of special economic zone in southern China, especially in Guangzhou province. There are 3 special economic zones in Guangzhou province: Zhuhai, Shenzhen, and Shantou. And in this case, I'm really looking at Shenzhen, which was established in 1979, which many people will call that is the birth of the city. That is the birth of Shenzhen. Thank you. This one, okay. That is the birth of Shenzhen, the city, which is something that I actually contest in my later research. Again, just quickly through a few of the images. Again, the year 1979. And there we go. You can see that there are some specks of white urbanized land, especially along the coast of Shenzhen. So this is the administrative border between Shenzhen and the rest of Guangzhou province. And there is a border here between Shenzhen and Hong Kong. So this would be the new territories of Hong Kong. 1986, 5 years later, you can see that the urban cluster really started there and is starting to grow. 5 years later, 1990, 94, 98, 2002, 2004. So this is 10 years ago, and the urbanization it essentially has stopped only because there's no more land to grow. Starting from 2004, all of the green areas you see are really very, very tall mountain ranges that cannot be flattened. A lot of the urbanized land actually were very hilly terrain and agricultural land that was flattened to make way for the city. So just as in terms of a population and economic contrast, in 1979, the population is 300,000 with a GDP of 1.96 RMB. This is million RMB. And by year 2005, the population already reached 12 million with a GDP of 500 billion RMB. So the rate of growth is quite unprecedented in terms of both economic development and population increase. Because of the what I was talking about earlier in terms of the geological, now there's kind of the geological imposition of simply there are no more land to develop. Since 2005, the city have turned its attention to some what they've called underdeveloped and undervalued land. And these are the topic of my, the focus of my research, which I would give you a hint of here. Much of the city are extremely, I would say, high rise. Not necessarily for me, it's not necessarily high density, but they are demolishing, in the process of demolishing a lot of particular urban clusters or enclaves that they see is not compatible with the image of the city that it's trying to cultivate. And as far as the image of the city goes, this is a very representational image of the planning of the city. You have basically an absolute central axis with the city hall here. This is sort of the government seat. This is a grand urban park. It's actually a very beautiful park with a large central park, is what they call it, with a crystal island in the middle. OMA, RAM's office in Hong Kong just won the competition last year to design that transportation hub. And an exhibition center, a very large-scale exhibition center designed by German office. So, and either side is designed, it's planned and designed to be high-rise and high-value office towers and residential blocks. So that's a bit zoom-in image of kind of this axial formal planning. All of these roads are 8-lane roads, basically, on either way. And to cross from what they call the sort of citizen center into the park is absolutely risking your life. I would not recommend it. I tried to do it once to take photographs, and it was very, very scary. And this is the crystal island I mentioned earlier off of the central axis. I want to draw your attention to this. By the way, this is a map that was published in the year 2000. And what you see in this area, I want you to keep in mind, it looks like quite Corbusian kind of urban courtyard of essentially high-rise residential buildings is what is planned. So this is published, the map image is published in the year 2000. This is a satellite image from 2008 of the exact same area. So you can see the Central Park is actually quite blank. There's no vegetation, and the Crystal Island is not there. And this is the actual state of that particular urban block. So essentially, this is the image of the city, of really what the city would like to portray as a global city, economic powerhouse. And this is the actual reality of the city. And I like to just take you on a quick tour. If you've been to Shenzhen, chances are you've driven across this artery. It's called Shenan Boulevard. It is sort of the central artery that many important political, in this case, this is the political seat, the political, cultural, economic, and industrial zones. They're all kind of centered along this cluster. So your taxi or your bus probably just went through this very beautifully landscaped and manicured urban landscape. So zooming in, this is Shenan Boulevard. I want to draw your attention to something quite peculiar. You see these little blocks here, these small gridded urbanization. Even here, it's this little tiny cluster stuck between two golf courses. And it's not unusual. See, this is that cluster. This is the one I had showed you earlier. If we sort of kind of move along the urban block, you see they're really literally quite along the road, except when you're driving on the central artery, because these are kind of hidden behind vegetation and really beautiful palm trees and very beautiful high-rise shopping malls or buildings, chances are you really would never see it. And if we zoom in a little bit more, so you can see kind of the contrast in scale between the buildings that lines the road and these smaller blocks. So if we zoom in, this is what they are. This is a particular urban village called Baishizhou. It is right in the middle of the most well-landscaped district in Shenzhen called Overseas Chinese Town, OCT. It has the highest real estate value in terms of residential development, and this enclave is right in the middle of all of these essentially tourist attraction and very expensive luxury villas. So these enclaves are made up of these type of buildings. The tile houses in front of you in the foreground is actually pretty rare. There are not so many of them left. These were the buildings that were built in the early 1980s, right after the establishment of the special economic zone. Most of these type of buildings have given away to these. I guess in Eugene they would be considered mid to high rise. In Shenzhen, Hong Kong, this is considered low rise of these buildings. And what's interesting is that each of these buildings is actually owned by one person. And that person essentially is the original villagers of over 300 villages that used to occupy the land in Shenzhen. So when the central government decided to make Shenzhen into a special economic zone and later a municipal city, the common perception is that there was nothing there. If you read any either scholarly or journalistic writing on Shenzhen, usually the first sentence is, in 1979, there was nothing, this sleepy little fishing village turned into the mega city overnight. That's kind of the typical jargon. But in actual terms, the land was fully occupied and fully used before it became a city. As I said, there were over 300 villages, and each village had a few hundred villagers, and they farmed the land. They grew rice, they grew bananas, lychee. They were also, especially along the coast, they were fishermen. They grew shrimp and oysters. So the land was completely productive already at the time. And when the government turned the land into the city, they basically bought off all of the farming land and gave the village land gave the village land to the original villagers to say, okay, you can build a single-family home in this particular area, and we're going to buy off all of the farming land from you to build our city. And essentially the villagers didn't have a choice to say no. So this is what they built. What I mentioned, that what you're seeing essentially is first generation of the buildings they have built with the tiled roofs. And what you see now is probably 6th and 7th generation of the buildings in these villages. And the common term is they're referred to as urban villages or villages in the city. And it's a way kind of to designate its less I think social, less legal status, more social status. These are really seen as not part of the city formal. They're really seen as an anomaly, or as what the government would call it, cancers in the urban fabric. But if we kind of zoom in a little, you'll see that it is quite incongruent. It is quite in contrast to kind of Shenzhen, the global city image, where you have essentially waste just kind of collected on the corner of this public space, because the civic infrastructure of the city actually doesn't extend into these urban enclaves. So in terms of sanitation, power, electricity, sewage, they all are self-generated in these urban clusters. But what drew my interest when I first started getting to know these places is really the vibrant humanity that is in these neighborhoods. In this case, and also the incredible flexibility and diversity of space use. This is a basketball court that's very actively used, and in the daytime it's also used as temporary parking for merchants that come in and drop off food. It's very much used on a daily basis, and at night this area becomes a 大排档, essentially a food court. And if you essentially walk into this place like I did for the first time, this was almost 10 years ago at 2 a.m, because I couldn't sleep, because I was put by the government in this luxury hotel next door. Couldn't sleep, started walking, and stumbled this place 2 a.m, and I was totally shocked. It was dogs and kids and babies and food and smoke everywhere, and it's so different from the city that I came to know as Shenzhen through my kind of working relationship with the government at the time. This is right next to the basketball court. This is a well that has been here, I've been told by the local villagers, for over 8,000 years. So they still get the water from the well, because they say actually the water here is much cleaner than what they get out of the tap in their homes. Like I said, the scale of the space, and again, this is really unintentional. The scale of the urban streets are very pedestrian friendly and beautiful. And I'm looking at this, I'm thinking you feel like this maybe is familiar, but in Shenzhen, this is unless you're in one of the urban villages, you would never actually see urban spaces like this right on the sidewalk or right on the street. And there are a lot of very interesting, I would say, architectural anomalies in the urban villages. For example, this is an elementary school for the children of the migrant workers who live in the urban villages. Because most of the migrant workers who live in these places do not hold the official status of the hukou, which is the Chinese term for kind of urban citizenship. They have no access to the social welfares that is available to regular urban citizens. So that ranges from medical all the way to education of the young. So this one particular urban village kind of took out its initiative, and they converted what was an abandoned parking garage into an elementary school. And I have never seen such a beautiful way and playful way of entering an elementary school. It's quite fun. And then they converted these sort of spaces inside into classrooms. I just wonder that it must be fun to kind of grow up and learn how not to walk in a straight line in here. And other things that is very touching, and then I think reminds me of lessons we have forgotten about public space and community. This is just a tiny little, you can see it's maybe 1.5 meters wide street, alleyway in one of the urban villages with a small temple at the end. Every month during a particular Chinese lunar calendar month, this alleyway is filled with people. Of people who not only live in this urban village but from all over the city. That's because this temple has been here for 300-400 years old, and it's known to be able to grant your wishes. It's kind of like the St. Petersburg, but in a shoebox. So they line up the street. They each take turns to give incense, and they leave. And this is only one day of the month. And the rest of the 29 days, it's just a quiet little room with children playing in front of it. It makes us question this notion that somehow that we need these grand, large-scale public spaces in a high-density or high-volume city. This is a very typical site in the urban villages. Practically all of the urban villages will have one of these. These are ancestry halls that they've been around for as long as the village has been there. While the building itself, this may have been rebuilt last year, right? While the material itself is not necessarily historic, but its function is. It really acts as a community center that attracts the locals. For example, eating outside. This is sort of entering, looking out. That space then becomes a parking space for people. This is kind of the first courtyard when you enter. This is a young man who was really actively wanting to show off his skills of kickboxing the day I was visiting. So basically this space is a gym for the younger generation. And you go inside, the sort of second ceremonial courtyard is full of mahjong tables for the middle-aged parents. And then further inside still are the plaques to sort of the ancestors who has passed away from several hundred years old to recently. So what is interesting to me, and from the courtyard you can see these concrete sort of modern buildings that's been built to house the migrants who are seeking cheap and affordable housing here. And what's remarkable to me is that this notion that there is really a continuity of history. The history here is not designated to be a particular space or particular view or in isolation from what is happening today. That it's quite a seamless understanding of the past, present, and future, which is so different from the way that generally when people talk about Shenzhen, somehow there is this notion that there was a tabula rasa, there was a blank slate, everything was wiped clean, and then you put the city there. And to me, that not only is this a false understanding, it's a very dangerous one, because then the notion of a special economic zone that needs to have a blank slate, or that was based on a blank slate that became very successful economically, this notion has been exported all over the world. There's in India over several thousand special economic zones, in Africa, in Latin America, and most of them are extremely contagious, and there's a lot of violence actually with local villagers when they are trying to do this. And most of the governments who want to create special economic zones in these developing countries have Shenzhen in mind as model, without realizing actually there's such a big element of the city. It's still from the aspect of the region or the land that wasn't wiped clean, that has stayed there and became a very vibrant aspect of the continuous city. I have this image up. It's a very typical local scene. It's a small convenience shop when you walk into the urban villages, and what you see, these brightly colored papers, what's on them are rent, the value of rent for either a room, an apartment, for either a day or a month or a year. So what happens is that if you are a 17-year-old from a rural village in Henan, you come to Shenzhen, you have no money, you're looking for a job, where do you stay? You sort of come into one of these urban villages, you look up the phone number and the price of housing, and you get a room for a day and maybe for a month. So what has happened is that all of the urban villages has become homes to the majority of the working class migrants who are not living in dormitory campuses, such as Foxconn. And that's another story about why, for me, these type of spaces are so valuable, because I'm sure you guys are all aware of the dangers and tragedies of what happens in these dormitories, where you have no freedom, as you have here. And the type of urban space you see and neighborliness is quite amazing. Now, keep in mind the people you see when you walk into these urban villages and walk around, they're not the original villagers. The original villagers are landlords that own these buildings and build them. They're very, very wealthy. They're my neighbors in Hong Kong. they send their kids to Cambridge and Harvard because they collect rent from all the people who live there. So essentially the 90% of the population in these urban villages are the migrant workers who come, some of them have been here for 20 years and some here for 20 days. But there is three different types of citizenship in the city. There are the urban residents who live in the city proper, who are what you say white-collar workers. There are the villagers, the original villagers who owns these sort of plots of land, who's built these buildings, and they're collecting rent from the migrants. And then there are the migrants. So it's really a three-tier social structure we're talking about. So I get back to this image. This is the first urban village the government tried to demolish demolished in 2005, and it was quite a media spectacle. The mayor at the time invited all of the state media, the local media to come and witness the demolition. What is interesting is that several of the buildings, this is one of them, after the mayor pressed the ceremonial red button and the Big Bang, it didn't fall the first time, and it didn't fall the second time. They had to do it 3 times to demolish it. And what's ironic is that the reason, one of the biggest, there's many, but one of the biggest stated reasons for the demolition of these is poor quality of construction. But what this process have told us is actually these buildings, because they are owned and built by landowners, and this is very rare in China. You guys would know that in China there is no private land ownership in cities, so there's very few actually buildings that's owned by a private individual. But because it's this strange loophole, the owner, the original villager, hired the best construction team. They used the best material. They used tons of concrete, tons of steel, and really made sure that the building is of high quality. But as you can imagine, this is not necessarily all across the board. So what you see is that these type of buildings are being demolished to make way for what's behind it. These are luxury high-rise residential towers. Is the Hong Kong model of housing towers with a podium that's of shopping malls in the bottom and apartments above. The reality is that the people that's been moved out of these village-built housing cannot afford these buildings. So essentially what you have is that you have very large populations displaced each time there is a demolition of the current urban village. So you might think that these urban villages are a minor part of the city, but this is a density mapping. Essentially it has a building footprint of all of the buildings within the urban center of Shenzhen. So Shenan Boulevard is right there, kind of cutting through. But if you look at this drawing, what's interesting, you might notice, is that there are these kind of black zones of density that is kind of dispersed throughout the city. And what they are all the urban villages. So now there are remaining around 90 urban villages in Shenzhen, and it's estimated they house 10 million people, essentially 50% of the city's population. And the urban village, they occupy about 10% of the land, of the residential land. So you essentially have 50% of the population living in 10% of the available residential land. Even with this incredible density, incredible vibrancy, and occupation of these land, they are seen as undervalued and underdeveloped land because they do not fit within the image of what is commonly perceived to be a modern city, a beautiful city, and a picturesque city. So that's kind of a broad overview of the this particular, what it is, informal urbanism in Shenzhen, named the urban villages. And next, I'd like to show you a project we done a couple years ago. It was a competition. It was a competition sponsored by the local municipal government in Shenzhen, and it's quite a special case. It's quite a special location. And I like to share with you for two reasons. One is to further kind of dispel the myth that Shenzhen has no history. And second, as kind of a point of a sharing and discussion with you about what are the responsibilities, the powers, and limitations of architecture in such a complex urban environment. So, the title, the project is called Nantou Ancient City Urban Renovation. It's a mouthful, but this is essentially a timeline of Nantou City. It's actually, let me see. Recall the history that I was saying that it was Shenzhen was founded in 1979, and that's the day most people assume that's when civilization happened and started happening on the land. But the truth is actually there is it's kind of faint, isn't it? There is a capital city on the region already called Nantou for over 1,000 years. Actually, technically 1,700 years. It's been this military and administrative center of the entire region since the Jing dynasty there. And as it moved into the Ming dynasty and Qing dynasty, it slowly actually grew in power and importance over the entire region of the Pearl River Delta, including the territories of Hong Kong and Macau. Of course, then Hong Kong and Macau was still part of China. And in fact, the administrative seat of the entire Pearl River Delta at the time was situated in Nantou, located right in the middle of today's Shenzhen. So this particular historic city today is this. A lot of it has been, I would say most of it has been demolished. And a lot of the area, you cannot see the remnants of the city anymore. But, so when the competition was called into this site, so this is the perimeter of the historic city. It was clearly stated there are only 7 remaining historic buildings that is registered with the city government as being historic. And the rest of all of these buildings with the high density are considered non-important and non-historical, especially. Part of the reason why the government is very anxious to find a solution in how to restore a certain historical significance to the site, and to remind people that they certainly have discovered that Shenzhen actually has a very rich history, and try to, now that the city has really moved past industrialization and really past urbanization, it's kind of moving into post-industrialization and trying to kind of brand the city as a green city, as a cultural city, as a city with significant culture and heritage. So this is why this place that has been forgotten essentially during all 30 years of the official urbanization of Shenzhen suddenly is remembered, and suddenly saying, okay, let's try to do something. Let's renovate this so that we can show people how long of a history Shenzhen has. But the difficulty is that there's only 7 buildings left that is of any historical value. What are the rest of the buildings? The rest of the buildings, as you can see, it's very mixed, different heights and different ages. Essentially, this place has become an urban village. So all of the buildings that were demolished were rebuilt by the local residents into what you've seen in the previous images of these kind of concrete bunkers, concrete buildings that's been built to house migrant renters who come in and look for housing. And as it is very typical of all of the urban villages, it has a very, very vibrant street life. These are the different commercial and commercial, cultural, and just everyday life that happens in the streets that is, to me, quite precious and quite rare in any Chinese city today. This is an analysis. These three are the main streets of this particular. It was called, I guess today's a neighborhood of this particular neighborhood, with a cataloging of all of the programs that's along the street. So the image is too small probably to be read, but every line is a different shop with a different program. So you would have like animal hospitals next to a grocery store, next to a cell phone seller, next to a noodle shop, for example. So an incredible mix of different program and different storefronts. It's quite faint, isn't it? All right. So the orange buildings are the historic buildings that is designated by the city as of value to preserve, but because of many years of neglect, they become kind of unofficial storage areas for the people who live next door. They kind of sneak in and put their stuff. So all of these photos are kind of taken through cracks of gates and locked doors. So they're not used. They're kind of just, they've been left there for 20, 30 years because no one knows what to do with them. So the yellow blobs you see, the yellow are the type of, when we did a detailed survey of the area, the yellow is what we have found to be also of sort of historical significance. They were residential buildings, essentially these single-story family homes that's been left and untouched. So what happens apparently is a lot of the owners either went abroad overseas, or they somehow do not have enough money to invest to demolish these buildings to build the more higher-rise buildings as renters. But but still there are people living in them as very, very low rent housing. This is a mapping of the available civic infrastructure. So you see actually the land outside of the historic city is very well connected, and there's not much there. But inside, the infrastructure only goes as far as the few main streets, and all of these streets are kind of are left on their own to try to either make their own water supplies and drainage and such. So what happens is that this area has a lot of infrastructural problems, a shortage of water, frequent blackouts, frequent flooding during heavy rain. So what we decided that when we took on the competition is that one of our main goals is to really be able to upgrade the urban space and the street space for the residents to really improve their daily life. So you can see these are everywhere. These are essentially water machines because they don't have enough water in the buildings. So children would line up and use these big containers to get water. So the drainage is made very haphazardly on the street, and very unsafe conditions wires, self-connected electrical wires. So what we outlined was 5 major urban design strategies. The first few are, the first one, it is what was specified in the design brief as the main objective, is to renovate significant public spaces. So we said, fine, we do that. But we also wanted to upgrade the street space. We wanted to preserve the historical monuments into of something of use. We also want to conserve the historical residential buildings. And lastly, actually what is most important for us is we wanted to improve the basic public infrastructure with sustainable environmental technologies. So what we developed is a implementable urban street section. The text is quite small, so maybe I can't see them. Can you see them? Okay, good. So it ranges everything from installing water tanks on the roof for rainwater collection and just as a water reserve for use for the building, but also connecting to what we're installing kind of periodically, these kind of composite or urban infrastructure that will house sanitation, that would house sort of new lighting, street lighting. There's essentially after dark, the whole space is completely in the dark because they don't even have enough electricity to light the residential buildings. And so these water tanks are also designed to be connected to localized fire hydrant, because one of the biggest crimes that the government see that the urban village have is that is a fire hazard, because they're saying that the streets are too narrow for normal fire trucks to get into them. So what we had thought is that we really wanted to put these sporadically equally spaced throughout the neighborhood so that it can give time for an alternative approach and kind of delay the time that's necessary for the fire teams to be able to get to the site. We're also proposing to essentially regrade all of the streets with new drainage channels that's going to collect the rainwater for other use as to really prevent current flooding. We're also proposing for new ducts to be planted, water, electricity, telecommunications and such, so that it can really meet the extreme high demand of this area, which houses about, I'd say, 12,000 people actually live in the neighborhood, but the infrastructure that's going to here actually is only meant to house a few hundred people. Right? So that's why there's these huge discrepancy in between. So these were diagrams to show the ways that we really wanted to very simply upgrade the street. What we didn't want is kind of a total demolition and rebuild, or to build this into very picturesque spaces, because we really wanted to have minimal interference to the daily operations of the shops and the urban residents. So this is a typical street in the neighborhood, and we really wanted to preserve as much as we can of what is kind of beautiful that's already there. So with new street space, lighting, urban furniture, and simple vegetation and landscape that can give life to the city without taking away what's already there. And for the monuments, for the historic monuments that has been just completely sectioned off from the everyday life, we wanted to open them up, renovate them, and have all of the historic monuments be visitable spaces that can house what we call a distributed museum. So all of the 7 historic monuments can become one museum system for people to be able to visit and occupy. And then for the residential buildings, to be able to convert some of the residential buildings into museum spaces and community spaces. And what is important is that we really wanted to, in the renovation, still keep the street vendors on the street and to actually give them facilities they can use, as opposed to typically most of these projects would try to really get rid of them. And again, sort of lastly, what's really important is we wanted to simply improve the basic infrastructure and the environment of the place. So we chose 3 intersections as the 3 public spaces for more detailed renovation. This is at the entrance of the gate, so the monument, one of the monumental museum become kind of an entrance museum gallery to house visiting information for the visitors, whereas the rest of the renovation goes to improving the existing residential buildings. This is at the middle section where we wanted to build outdoor theaters and basketball courts and sports facilities and the sitting areas for the community right in the middle, and to provide night lighting for the public spaces and the night markets. Again, this is another historic monument. It's going to propose for it to be used and for the urban space to continuously be opening into them to connect the city, essentially the city's current modern life with the historical past. The second component of this competition was to design a urban cultural park. They want an urban cultural park right outside of the historic city to be able to provide public amenities to both to the citizen inside and to the city in general. And the government gave a type of an insinuation of what they wanted. They really wanted to have these pagodas that is scattered throughout the landscape, because to them that is what would be historical. But because this was always a secular place of governance, there was never any pagodas in all of its nearly 2,000-year history. So we said, rather than fake history, we really should look into kind of the real cultural heritage of the place. And one thing we had discovered that's really interesting is that this region, right, this was all called, before it was Hong Kong, Shenzhen, etc., this whole area was called Xin'an. And during the Qing dynasty, this area is very, very famous, known throughout China, from Beijing to Hunan, etc., for its beautiful natural scenery. And that poets, artists, literary people would travel for months from northern China to this place to visit its local landscapes and sceneries. And it was so well known, it was called Xin'an Bajing, 8 scenes of Xin'an. And we discovered they actually have real places and real locations, and the numbers is showing they're really scattered throughout the region, even in modern day Hong Kong, modern day Guangzhou, etc. And their drawings and depictions of what these were, and associated with each scene was a specific landscape, and they had a specific history and a specific title. And what we thought was was an opportunity is that in this space to kind of recreate, not necessarily sort of fake past or fake imagery, but to create modern landscapes using the vegetation and kind of the poetic essence of these scenes here for modern day use at this location. So the first scene that we have designed actually is a pathway, a walkway, because the historic first scene was named after this called wutong tree, this really beautiful, tall species of trees that was very special to the region. So a lot of the scenes were of vegetation and landscape that's only locally available, and it's these landscape and these vegetation that's what gave the cultural meaning of the place. And what we discovered is that even though the city wall was demolished several hundred years ago, but what's interesting is that you still see a path of it, because all of the Chinese city walls are built on rammed earth. It's very difficult for vegetation to grow. So you see that even in locations where dense forest has overtaken the city, it left kind of this trace, if you will, of the city wall that was once there. So what we propose is that the first scene is actually a planted walkway all around the historic city. Essentially, you will be walking on top of what once was the city wall. So again, this is an example that's through these ways that we wanted to really make a composite of something that would be useful to modern day life, that still evoke a sense of the history of the place, both spatially and culturally. So this is the park. This is the land that they said that they wanted to build into the park, with a few very large buildings still remaining. This is actually a long-distance bus terminal. This is a parking garage. So the first thing would be the walk around the historic park, and we divided then the rest of the 7 scenes in sequence as you would enter from here. This is the first scene. So we tried to really use the original names and poetry that was associated with the original scene to design the modern landscape. So the original title, for example, for scene 1 was Parasol-Treed Mountain with Heavenly Pond. So the idea is to really create these very tall vegetation with the local trees that create parasols and shade you from the light and the extreme heat of the region. Second scene was called Peach Plum in Low Mountain. So we used locally well-known peach plum trees to create what are tennis courts and badminton courts throughout. So I see we're running short on time, so I'm just going to show you quickly the scenes. So essentially, each one is composed of modern-day use as a park space and utilizing indigenous vegetations that creates a sense of the past. And this is created as a kind of a water landscape, so that you would, when you go from the modern city, before you enter the ancient city, you kind of go through the ceremonial walk. And this water pond is also used as a retention pond for the rainwater that was collected throughout the city. So that, again, that is programmatically, spatially, and culturally all linked together as layers of space. I said that there was a major parking garage structure, for example, and what we did is that we kind of created a herb cascade that would kind of cover the parking structure, because this region, the final scene of the region was really about the local grown herbs that was so fragrant that traveled for miles, etc. So the sensorial perception along with programmatic ideas. So in this case, zoning in the park is really by color of the vegetation and by different types of vegetation, going sort of from water, wetland spaces to bamboo groves to herb gardens, etc. And that's what sort of create the spatial sequence throughout the zone with kind of fully loaded and required a program for the park space. And the different zones that was created in the park are extensions from the streets from inside the historic park. So that, again, trying to create a linkage and trying to create a continuum. And that was the notion I was talking about when sort of the research into the urban villages is something really inspiring to understand that the best way for the city to continue to be, to not use the word sustainable growth, but really kind of responsible and rooted in ideas and culture and the way we live, is really to try to understand history as a continuum, and that there's equal value to what is happening today as there into the past. In fact, when we looked into further history of the place, this area by the Qing Dynasty, its nickname was Nine Streets. So this area, what's interesting is that even though there's only a handful of historic buildings left, the street pattern, the Nine Street pattern, still remained. Again, it was from the Qing Dynasty, the street already formed. So the street space, we were so trying to carefully preserve that spatial infrastructure was there, and it's what we used to argue to the government that it's really not about the buildings per se, it's really about the urban life and the urban space that continues the urban life. So we were able to convince the international jury panel of the argument of trying to really use a contemporary means to lightly preserve, evoke, and improve the quality of life in this place, along with the UK-based architecture office. The two of us were selected by the international jury to be winners of the competition, and we were submitted to the government. The government was supposed to choose one of us to continue with the commission, and the government engaged us to continue further studies, to develop further. That was 2 years ago. It's still ongoing. Part of the issue now is that some people in the government actually have now wanted having a new idea for this place, because the argument is that if all of the urban villages inside the urban center are being demolished, rebuilt, why shouldn't this one be demolished and rebuilt? In fact, here's the opportunity to demolish the urban village illegal structures and to rebuild what the city once was in its glorious past. Obviously, it is something that I'm very against. I hope I don't have to explain why. So currently, we are trying to come up with ways to try to negotiate with the local government, the local interested parties, but it is a very difficult struggle because actually the original villagers, meaning the people who own the buildings, they want this to be demolished. They want the government and developers to invest money so that their buildings will grow in value. So they don't have kind of a sentiment with these buildings or the people who live in them, because essentially they're renters. So as I was saying, there's sort of three levels of citizenship, and the top two levels of citizenship essentially all want to see these urban villages demolished, because they really don't see that it is valuable to a modern city. The last citizenship, the people who live in here, because they're migrant workers and they don't have much political sway or economic sway, it's very difficult for them to form communities, to form a type of resistance. And us as architects and urban designers and landscape designers, we have found that now we're shifting from designers into activism, and that in fact we must do this in order to pursue the type of responsible design that we were trained and educated to do. But this is actually very difficult in the context of a fast-developing, urbanizing economic environment. This sitting here in Eugene, Portland, this may seem so obvious. You're sitting there thinking, how can the government resist this? How can there not be total community outrage? But you have to remember, every culture and every space have its moments of urbanization. Just think of the 50s and 60s in New York, in Chicago. Think of Robert Moses. We went through all of that as well. And the historical lessons we have learned are very painful. But we haven't exported those lessons. We've exported star architects, and we exported corporate planning. The central planning of CBD was done by SOM. So we exported all of these things. So I would say that in closing, that I hope for the students, all of you, with the sort of great education you're receiving about how to design and build responsibly, sustainably, I hope all of you really gear up towards a very meaningful future in which that your role would be significantly more important in trying to find a place and find a role for that of an architect within a global environment that is very much urbanizing and under a tremendous trend of informalization. So for you now to really look upon your role, your future role, I hope that you're both excited but also feel a sense of duty. That I think a lot of these things, I tell my students in Hong Kong, that I think a lot of what I'm trying to argue for and trying to change, really namely trying to change the image of the modern city, trying to change the notion that a city should look a certain way, that a green space should look a certain way, a street should look a certain way, and a park is necessary even. And I tell my students, probably not going to be me who changed that. I can try to educate and research, and probably will be my students, and maybe eventually your students one day would be able to create a new meaning to architecture. Thank you.
So we're going to move directly into our panel. We're going to change over for 5 minutes and introduce the next event right after that. So 5-minute break. Meet us right back here for our next panel.